there anyway for a chat and what have you, so we do encourage you to use the facilities we provide for you. And finally, our speaker today is Richard Field, who is a long-time teacher at our own Shrewsbury school here. He read English at Cambridge, retired and given talks on historical and literary subjects in the United Kingdom and abroad as well. And today Richard is talking about the novels of Nancy Mitford, and the quote he gives me is that truth may be stranger than fiction, but fiction is truer. Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Richard Field.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and thank you for reminding me of what the title of my boom is. Yes, truth may be stranger than fiction, but fiction is truer. It was Lord Byron who said that truth is stranger than fiction, but it was a man called Frederick Raphael who said that fiction is truer. You may remember him. He was, I can't remember the name of the television program that he was in the 1970s.
Returning prizes.
Hooray! Thank you very much. I know I have backup here, and if, as frequently happens with me, my brain goes completely numb, then please, you've started off very well and I'm grateful to you. So, this is really a celebration of Nancy Mitford, and that, I suppose, is what we're here for the novels of Nancy Mitford. And the best moments in this talk, which when I last read it to my long-suffering wife took 50 minutes plus, plus that is for reminding her to put her hearing aid in. It lasts about 50 minutes or so, and I hope that it will mean that if you haven't already read Nancy Mitford, you will want to. If you have but haven't read her for some time, you will feel like going back to revisit her. That's really what I hope to achieve, a sufficient interest in the wonderful, wonderful Nancy Mitford and her glorious prose and her wit, a sufficient interest for you to want to read it again. So let's get started. There is a photograph in existence of Aunt Sadie and her 6 children sitting round the tea table at Alconley. The table is situated as it was, is now, and ever shall be, in the hall, in front of a huge open fire of logs. Over the chimney piece, calmly, plainly visible in the photograph, hangs an entrenching tool with which, in 1915, Uncle Matthew had whacked to death 8 Germans, one by one, as they crawled out of a dugout. It is still covered with blood and hairs, an object of fascination to us as children. In the photograph, Aunt Sadie's face, always beautiful, appears strangely round, her hair strangely fluffy, and her clothes strangely dowdy. But it is unmistakably she who sits there with Robin in oceans of lace lolling on her knee. She seems uncertain what to do with his head, and the presence of Nanny waiting to take him away is felt, though not seen. The other children, between Louisa's 11 and Matt's 2 years, sit round the table in party dresses or frilly bibs, holding cups or mugs according to age, all of them gazing at the camera with large eyes opened wide by the flash, and all looking as if butter would not melt in their round, pursed-up mouths. There they are, held like flies in the amber of that moment. Click goes the camera, and on goes life. The minutes, the days, the years, the decades, taking them further and further from that happiness and promise of youth, from the hopes Aunt Sadie must have had for them, and for the dreams they dream for themselves. I often think there is nothing quite so poignantly sad as old family groups. So who are those people in the group? They are the Radlett family, a fictionalized version of the Mitford family. I expect you recognize the opening paragraph of The Pursuit of Love, published in 1945, the first of Nancy Mitford's quartet of mature novels published after the war. The precursor to Love in a Cold Climate, The Blessing, and Don't Tell Alfred, novels in which she used some of her own experiences to chart in her witty and engaging way the various vicissitudes and eccentricities of the English upper class, as well as some personal and contemporary events. The central character, Fanny, appears in them all. Nancy is never quite Fanny, nor Fanny quite Nancy, but the novels are based on characters Nancy Mitford knew. It wasn't, of course, the first time she'd employed such techniques. Friends and relatives had appeared in Highland Fling, Christmas Pudding, Wigs on the Green, and Pigeon Pie, all written between 1931 and 1940. The Pursuit of Love, however, was the book which gave birth to what you might now think of as the Mitford industry. Nancy's brilliance as a novelist is arguably the primary reason why the Mitford family is still remembered. In this beautifully structured paragraph, there are delicate touches hinting at the fun that is to come and clues to be followed up by those who are almost inevitably drawn into the game of how true is this? Was it really like that? How strictly autobiographical is it? For it is a novel with an autobiographical slant, though not always a factual one. The truth of fiction. Let me introduce you to, or remind you of, some of the clever ingredients Nancy Mitford's novels are discernible in this opening paragraph. The table is situated as it was, is now, and ever shall be, in the hall in front of a huge open fire of logs. Alkenley, the Mitford house, is represented as the ancestral house of the family and is a general tease. Tease, a favorite word of Nancy Mitford's and a favorite occupation. The reference to the Gloria, as it was, is now in the beginning, and now and ever shall be, world without end, suggests not only a sense of the permanence of aristocratic families, but it's also an in-joke for those who knew the Mitfords. Alkenley, the physical ancestral house, never existed. Although the Mitfords could trace their lineage back to the Norman conquest, they did not live in an ancestral house. In a draft for a broadcast, after The Pursuit of Love was published, Nancy wrote, "I have described the early years of myself and my 5 sisters and my 1 brother in my last book, with some alterations necessary to a work of fiction." Good line, that. But without exaggeration. Indeed, it would be hardly possible to exaggerate the eccentricity and restlessness of our upbringing. My father had 2 manias, for selling and for building. Our first home was a large Elizabethan palace built by my grandfather in 1900. My father sold it as soon as he could, and thereafter we lived under the shadow, so to speak, of 2 hammers, the builder's and the auctioneers, and fidgeted about from one house to another on different parts of my father's estate. Sometimes they were houses which already existed, but which were then altered to suit the requirements of so large a family. Sometimes, which is even worse, they were built from scratch. Alconley was a large, ugly, north-facing Georgian house built with only one intention, that of sheltering, when the weather was too bad to be out of doors, a succession of bucolic squires, their wives, their enormous families, their dogs, their horses, their father's relict, and their unmarried sisters. There was no attempt at decoration or softening the lines, no apology for a facade. It was all as grim and as bare as a barracks stuck upon the high hillside. Within, the keynote, the theme, was death. Not death of maidens, not death romantically accoutred with urns and weeping willows, cypresses and valedictory odes, but the death of warriors and of animals, stark, real. On the walls, halberds and pikes and ancient muskets were arranged in crude patterns with the heads of beasts slaughtered in many lands, and with the flags and uniform of bygone Radletts. The open fire of logs in the hall is a lead into one of my favourite descriptions of Uncle Matthew, who is, of course, Favre, Lord Ruysdael, the father of the girls. It appears in the novel when Nancy describes the midnight meetings the children sometimes had. It was safer to disobey rules during the early part of the night than at any other time in the 24 hours. Uncle Matthew fell asleep practically at the dinner table. He would then doze in his business room for an hour or so before dragging himself in a somnambulous trance to bed, where he slept the profound sleep of one who has been out of doors all day until cockcrow the following morning, when he became very much awake. This was the time for his never-ending warfare with the housemaids over wood ash. The rooms at Alconley were heated by wood fires, and Uncle Matthew maintained correctly that for these to function properly, all the ash ought to be left in. The fireplaces should be holding them in a great smouldering heap. Every housemaid, however, for some extraordinary reason, perhaps training with coal, was bent on removing this ash altogether. When shaking, imprecations and being pounced out on by Uncle Matthew in his paisley dressing gown at 6 a.m. had convinced them that this was not really feasible, they became absolutely determined to remove, by hook or by crook, just a little, a shovelful or so, every day. The result was guerrilla warfare at its most exciting. Uncle Matthew was always, winter and summer alike, out of his bed by 5 a.m. and it was then his habit to wander about, looking like the great Agrippa in his dressing gown, and drinking endless cups of tea out of a thermos flask until about 7, when he would have his bath. Breakfast for my uncle, my aunt, family and guests alike was sharp at 8, and unpunctuality was not tolerated. Uncle Matthew was no respecter of other people's early morning sleep, and after 5 o'clock one could not count on any, for he raged round the house, clanking cups of tea, shouting at his dogs, roaring at the housemaids, cracking the stock whips which he had brought back from Canada on the lawn with a noise greater than gunfire, and all to the accompaniment of Gully Gucci on his gramophone, an abnormally loud one with an enormous horn through which would be shrieked, "Una voce poco fa," the mad song from Lucia. Lo, hear the gentle lark, and so on, played at top speed, thus rendering them even higher and more screeching than they ought to have been. Nothing reminds me of my childhood days at Auchinleigh so much as those songs. The entrenching tool hanging over the chimney piece is clearly a spoof, especially that wonderful detail of the blood and hair still stuck to it. But the description of Uncle Matthew whacking 8 Germans to death as they crawled out gives a vivid picture of the fiery energy of her father, with just a hint of humor. Uncle Matthew, as he was in this novel and the subsequent 3, had made his debut in Nancy's earlier novel called Highland Fling, and he appears as General Murgatroyd. Suddenly, just in time, I noticed that he was a filthy Hun, and so of course I turned my back on him and refused to shake hands. I think he noticed. Anyway, I hope so. I hope he felt his position. General Murgatroyd looked round triumphantly. "Never shake hands with Catholics or Germans if I could help it," continued the general. The basic joke behind Highland Fling, written in 1931, is the revolt of the bright young things against the previous generation. The book revolves around a prolonged shooting party in Scotland, presided over by a young couple who've been asked to host the event while the owners of the castle have to be away. This results in some hilarious misunderstandings about shooting etiquette, as for instance a vignette which first appeared in one of Nancy's earliest public pieces in the Vogue on December 11th, 1929. The article was entitled, "The Shooting Party, Some Hints for the Woman Guest." When the man with whom you are standing breaks a heavy silence by saying angrily, "Shut up and lie down," remember that he is most probably addressing not you, but his dog. As far as some of the jitterbugging, champagne at breakfast drinking youth are concerned, there were more important issues. On more levels than one, there was resentment on both sides. "I think it's most shocking, most absolutely shocking," said the general, "the way some of you young people have quite forgotten what your elders suffered in the last 4 years. "We haven't exactly forgotten," said Albert, who is Robert Byron in disguise, "but it was never anything to do with us. It was your war, and I hope you enjoyed it. People of your class notoriously enjoy wars and fighting. This is only natural. You have been educated to that end. Your very recreations consist entirely in killing things, and it is more exciting to kill men than rabbits or foxes." That particular row is well balanced by Nancy Mitford via the intelligent interventions of an academic who fought in the war, initially against his will. The general, however, is not mollified. Deeply incensed, he retired to the study, where he listened to Iolanthe on the wireless and read his favourite book, Tegetamere on the Pheasant. Then there is Aunt Sadie, the Mitford's mother, Sydney, known to her children as Muv. She's a fascinating woman who often had a bad press from Nancy, who was convinced that for most of her life, her mother did not like her. In a letter to Jessica in 1971, she wrote, I have the greatest possible respect for her. I liked her company, but I never loved her, for the evident reason that she never loved me. I was never hugged or kissed by her as a small child. Indeed, I saw little of her. Here, in the opening paragraph of The Pursuit of Love, we have that revealing sentence referring to the baby sitting on her lap. She seems uncertain what to do with his head, and the presence of Nanny waiting to take him away is felt, though not seen. Given the era and parental attitudes towards children, there's not very much that would surprise us about that. As for the nanny, those of you who believe that Nancy Mitford never handed out a bouquet of roses without skillfully hidden thorns should read her essay on Nanny Blore, published in the Sunday Times in 1962. Here is an extract. Blore must have been superhuman. She seemed to have no favorites at all. Her fairness always amazed me. Even as a child, my vile behavior to the others was partly, I suppose, the result of jealousy and partly of a longing to be grown up and live with grown-up people. The others bored me, and I made them feel it. I expect I should have been much worse than I was, were it not for Nanny Blore. The final point I wish to make about that opening paragraph quoted so long ago concerns the beauty of the passage, in particular the comment on the photograph itself. There they are, held like flies, in the amber of that moment. Click goes the camera and on goes life. The minutes, the days, the years, the decades, taking them further and further from that happiness and promise of youth, from the hopes Aunt Sadie must have had for them, and from the dreams they dreamed for themselves. I often think there is nothing quite so poignantly sad as old family groups. Click goes the camera, and on goes life. What marvelous writing. The click of the moment of exposure, captured forever, and then the drawn out, life-passing vowel sounds of on goes life. It makes my eyes sting when I read that, and the rest of the sentence. Shades, perhaps, familiar to you of Ted Hughes, 6 young men, the celluloid of the photograph holds them well, 6 young men familiar to their friends. And Keats, Ode on a Grecian Urn, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. It's not that it's a particularly startling revelation, but it's something which is not confined to the period in which it was written. And if you were, well, I hope you will at some stage, not in the next 2 minutes, please, go home and look at some of those photographs, I think you'll know what was meant by that poignancy. But the great thing about it, I think, is that it is superbly written and superb literature. The Mitford girls became involved with an extraordinarily varied range of people. They were headstrong, fearless, and strikingly good-looking. And what made them notorious was summed up by their mother Sydney's famous remark, "Whenever I see a headlong beginning with Pierre's daughter, I know one of you children has been in trouble." But it wasn't the sort of trouble which newspapers broadcast so widely these days. It wasn't sex and drugs so much as politics which became increasingly virulent and partisan in those years between the wars. It's impossible to overemphasize the battle of the generations between the wars, exacerbated, as we know, by the experience of the First World War. You will require Charles Ryder's distant relationship with his father, Evelyn Waugh's irritation and occasional savagery with his, Betjeman's distance from Ernie, and I recall my father and I misunderstanding each other because he actually had flown Spitfires in the Second World War and I knew nothing of danger. What emerged in this period when Nancy Mitford was writing was a vigorous parting of political views. So you had fascism, Nazism, communism, socialism, Gaullism, and conservatism. Politics divided them as religion divided earlier generations. Sidney once cried out, "Oh, why do my daughters all fall for dictators?" Well, there's an element of exaggeration there, but nevertheless it's a remark worth picking up. You don't need your Penguin psychology book to know where this hero worship comes from. Uncle Matthew, aka Lord Redesdale, had never expected to inherit the title. That was one reason why he did not follow his elder brother to Eton, instead going to a school called Radlett. The other reason that was from an early age he was prone to such unpredictable outbursts of rage that his father thought he'd been embarrassment to his elder brother. There seems no doubt that these unpredictable rages were a feature of the children's upbringing and kept them on their emotional toes. When he was in jovial form, and by all accounts he could be achingly funny, he was the best company in the world. Part of the fun for the children lay in seeing how far they could go. There was the game of measuring his head with a tape measure to see how much brain there could possibly be in the old subhuman. One of Jessica's favourite games was to shake his hand while he was drinking tea to prepare him for the time when he would have the palsy. That doesn't sound like the behaviour of a child who was terrified of her father, though they all knew that even in the best moods they were tiptoeing through a minefield. His rages were absolutely terrifying, but the punishments were mild and predictably reduced to nothing. Perhaps the overall summary of the children's attitude to their father appears in The Pursuit of Love, where Nancy writes of Uncle Matthew, "Much as we feared, much as we disapproved of, passionately as we sometimes hated Uncle Matthew, he still remained for us a sort of criterion of English manhood. There seemed something not quite right about any man who was greatly different from him." I'm sure you are able to thread through the difference between fact and fiction here. With that in mind, it's interesting to consider Nancy's view of the Frenchman Gaston Paluski. I'll come back to that later because it's a particularly fascinating look into Nancy's mixture of fact, fiction, and fantasy. Jessica Mitford is harder on her father in Ons and Rebels, but neither plays down the great love Lord Redesdale felt for his wife. There's a touching little incident in The Pursuit of Love when Aunt Sadie is organising a ball for Louisa, Nancy, according to Deborah. Uncle Matthew has begrudgingly gone along with it, provided he is not expected to offer his horses or his shooting to the young guests. Then, with a very short time left, it's clear that Aunt Sadie is very, very worried about something. There are some wonderful throwaway lines from Nancy. Everything appeared to be going smoothly. The champagne had arrived, the band, Clifford Essex's third string had been ordered and would spend a few hours in Mrs. Craven's cottage. Uncle Matthew had been persuaded to get 20 oil stoves with which to emulate something of caressing warmth which we lacked. The problem is the sisters hadn't got enough men as supping and dancing partners. And now comes the touching moment, introduced without sentimentality, but with some sensitive humour. At last, Uncle Matthew saw that the situation would have to be taken in hand. He didn't care two hoots about the ball. He felt no particular responsibility for the amusement of his guests, whom he seemed to regard as an onrushing horde of barbarians. But he did care about Aunt Sadie's peace of mind. He could not bear to see her looking so worried, and he decided to take steps. He went up to London and attended the last sitting of the House of Lords before the recess. His journey was entirely fruitful. "Strombold, Paddington, Fort William and Kirkley have accepted," he told Aunt Sadie on his return, with the air of a conjurer producing 4 wonderful fat rabbits out of one small wine glass. Of course, those ancient relics were of little interest to the girls, but they relieved Aunt Sadie of the immediate problem, and that's the point. 2 things I want to say about that incident without, I hope, squashing the humour of it. It is a touching incident, but it is completely lacking in any sentimentality, as is all Nancy Mitford's writing. The criticism of Nancy is that she is frequently heartless, but she is capable of much sensitivity. And part of the joy of reading and rereading her lies in noticing such details beneath the wit and humour. The second thing is that it does present Lord Redesdale in a generous light, however fictional the incident might be, but actually it isn't. If you've read the Duchess of Devonshire's, now no longer with us, book, not Keep Up With Me, what's it, Wait For Me, you will see that she does write about this incident, and it was true. There is no doubt about it. Whereas, when I first read Otherwise Another Super Bit of Nancy Mitford inventing things, this is the excitement, I think, of reading about her. The title, The Pursuit of Love, could serve as the title of a biography of Nancy Mitford, or an autobiography. In many ways, it's the story of her life up until 1945. The story of the book is told by Linda's cousin Fanny, who comes frequently to stay at Alconley, joining in the Radlett's family life. The feuds with Uncle Matthew, days out hunting on the Cotswold upwells, the cosy conversation about sex in the linen room cupboard, known as the Hon's cupboard. And as Linda and Fanny grow up, they start to dream longingly of love, for the day when they will be swept off their feet by some dashing and romantic man. But it doesn't work like that. Linda marries straight out of the schoolroom, first a handsome, complacent boor called Kreutzig, a banker, then a dedicated communist, Christian, devoted to his cause and with little time to spare for his wife. Both times, Linda believed herself to be in love, and both times it had proved an illusion. Prod, Nancy's real husband, is divided into 2 as Linda's 2 husbands, by which I mean that Nancy selected 2 of those characteristics and put them in with Prod, who was, by all accounts, a pretty ghastly man. On the one hand, and this is part of Prod, was Tony Kreutzig, pompous and clever, his head full of a vast quantity of utterly dreary facts, of which he did not hesitate to inform his companions at great length and in great detail, whether they appear to be interested or not. Doubtless you'll know people like that. Nancy had experienced both sorts of men, most recently with Christian aka Prod, with whom she had travelled to Perpignan to help with refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and from whom she had fled in miserable frustration and despair. She had fled by train. It could not be said, thought Linda, as the train pursued its way through the blackness, that her life so far had been a marked success. She'd found neither great love nor great happiness, and had not inspired them in others. Where now was love that would last to the grave and far beyond? What had she done with her youth? Tears for her lost hopes and ideals, tears of self-pity, in fact, began to pour down her cheeks. The 3 fat Frenchmen who shared the carriage with her were in a snoring sleep. She wept alone. But when she presented her return ticket at the Gare du Nord, she was told that it had expired. Linda was paralyzed with horror. Her porter, tired of waiting beside a statue of despair, deposited the luggage at its feet and went grumbling off. Linda sank onto her suitcase and began to cry. Nothing so dreadful had ever happened to her before. She cried bitterly. She could not stop. People passed to and fro as if weeping ladies were the most ordinary phenomenon at the Gare du Nord. Fiends! Fiends! She sobbed. Why had she not listened to her father? Why had she ever come to this bloody abroad? When would, who would help her? In London, there was a society she knew, which looked after ladies stranded at railway stations. Here, more likely, there'd be one for shipping them off to South America. At any moment now, some genial-looking old woman might come up and give her an injection, after which she would disappear forever. Humor, yes. Sadness, yes. Together. She became aware that somebody was standing beside her. A short, stocky, very dark Frenchman in a black Homburg hat. And thus begins the one true love affair of Linda's life, or rather, of Nancy Mitford's. Fabrice, Duc de Sauveterre, is clever, funny, and amorous. A man of the world, and a Frenchman to his fingertips. He installs Linda in a pretty apartment in Paris, and here for nearly a year she lives a life as near perfect happiness as it is possible to attain. Then comes the war. Linda has to return to England while Fabrice disappears into the Resistance. She sees him only once more when he suddenly appears for 24 hours on a brief mission to London. And in the end, Linda dies giving birth to their child, and at about the same time, Fabrice is caught by the Gestapo and shot. That happened to the fictional Fabrice, but not to the actual Paluski, on which the character of Fabrice is based. It's all here, all Nancy's life in this novel, exaggerated in parts, circumstances changed, fantasies fulfilled, but as a testament of our heart and mind, it is truth, truth and fiction. Colonel Paluski, whether he appears as Fabrice in The Pursuit of Love, the Duc de Sauveterre in Love in a Cold Climate, or Charles Edward Marquis de Valhubert in The Blessing, was the great love of Nancy's life. Her muse, her dream lover, only partially come true, the center of her life. You will remember that The Pursuit of Love is dedicated to Gaston Paluski. Nancy fell headlong, obsessionally in love. It would last throughout her life, but though Paluski was for a time in love, with Nancy, he never loved her in the sense that she was the only woman for him. She was quite content to play him along. She knew that he would ultimately become totally devoted to her. And meanwhile, she laughed at the way he parried her declarations of love, telling Diana Cooper, "I say to him, 'I love you, Colonel,' and he replies, 'That's awfully kind of you.'" Nancy went to live in Paris in order to be near Paluski. But he had often suggested that, but he'd never made any practical suggestions. And in fact, Fabrice, a.k.a. Paluski, never bought her a flat or lived with him. The fact that at the end of the book, Nancy, dies in childbirth is bittersweet. Knowing that she would never be able to have children and gradually learning the full implications of Paluski's Catholicism was an underlying burden of anxiety for Nancy. Nevertheless, The Pursuit of Love is, in the final analysis, a love letter to Paluski. 4 years later, Love in a Cold Climate, or Diversions, as it was first called, was published in 1949. And once again, the narrator is Fanny, but there are old favourites from The Pursuit of Love. Uncle Matthew and the Radletts are still very much in evidence, as is the hypochondriac Uncle Davy. Exhausted and bored post the London season, Fanny stays with Aunt Emily and Uncle Davy. One morning, her aunt tells Fanny that she's received an invitation for her to stay with Lord and Lady Montdor for a house party at Hampton. Aunt Emily is delighted. "Oh, but what a pity it happens to be Davy's day for getting drunk. I long to tell him. He'll be very, very much interested." There was nothing for it, however, but to wait. Davy had quite passed out, and his heavy breathing could be heard all over the house. My uncle's lapses into insobriety had no vice about them. They were purely therapeutic. The fact is, he was following a new regime for perfect health, much in vogue at the time, he assured us, on the continent. "The aim is to warm up your glands with a series of jolts. The worst thing in the world is for the body to settle down and lead a quiet little life of regular habits. If you do that, it soon resigns itself to old age and death. Shock your glands, force them to react, startle them back into youth, keep them on tiptoe so that they never know what to expect next, and they have to keep young and healthy to deal with all the surprises." Accordingly, he ate in turns like Gandhi and like Henry VIII, went for 10-mile walks or lay in bed all day, shivered in a cold bath or sweated in a hot one, nothing in moderation. It's also very important to get drunk every now and again. The plot, however, belongs to the immensely rich and grand neighbours, Lord and Lady Montdor. The Montdors have one child, a daughter, heir to their enormous wealth and the centre of their lives. Polly is an apparently insipid beauty, and her ambitious mother has great plans for her. A duke, at least, or even higher. An abbey, an altar, an archbishop. A voice saying, "I, Albert, Edward, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David, take thee, Leopoldina." But Polly, as ruthless in her way as her mother, shatters her parents' hopes by marrying her uncle, Uncle Boy. No money, years older, and worst of all, Lady Montdor's bosom friend. Some say literally. Two dazzling pieces of writing, Jane Austen-like in their sharpness of wit, convey Lady Montdor. First is when Fanny is summoned to her room in the morning. Her quilt was covered with newspapers and opened letters, and she held the Times neatly folded back to the court circular, probably the only part of it she ever looked at, since news, she used to say, can always be gleaned, and far more entertainingly too, from those who make it. Good morning, Fanny dear. This will probably interest you, I suppose. She handed me the Times and saw that Linda's engagement to Anthony Crosig was announced at last. Poor Alconley, she went on, in tones of deep satisfaction. No wonder they don't like it. What a silly, silly girl. Well, she always has been, in my opinion. No place. Rich, of course, but bankers' money. It comes and it goes, and however much of it there may be, it's not like marrying all this. All this was a favourite expression of Lady Montaub's. It did not to me mean all this beauty, this strange and fairy-like house set in the middle of 4 great avenues rushing up 4 artificial slopes, the ordered spaces of trees and grass and sky. No, she had all the sentiment of her generation and sentimentality growing like a green moss over her spirit, helped to conceal its texture of stone inside. She was convinced that she was a woman of profound sensibility. All this on her lips meant position allied to such solid assets as acres, coal mines, real estate, jewels, silver, pictures, incunabula, and other possessions of that sort. Lord Montdor owned an almost incredible number of such things. Fortunately, I often think how interesting it would be to lock Lady Montmore into a room with Mrs. Dashwood. Remember the first chapter of Sense and Sensibility? I wonder who would come out first. During the course of the novel, Fanny gets married, something that Nancy longed for, to an Oxford don and goes to live there. As she so often does, Lady Montmore has called in unexpectedly for tea. And this is Fanny. As I got to know Lady Montmore more intimately, I began to realize that her selfishness was monumental. She had no thoughts except in relation to herself, could discuss no subject without cleverly edging it round to something directly pertaining to herself. The only thing she ever wanted to know about people was what impression did she make on them, and she would do anything to find this out, sometimes digging traps for the unwary, into which, in my innocence, I was very apt to tumble. I suppose your husband is a very clever man, at least so Montdor tells me. Of course, it's 1,000 pities he's so dreadfully poor. I hate to see you living in this horrid little hovel. So unsuitable, and not more important. But Montdor says he has the reputation of being clever. Oh, he's the cleverest man ever met, I said, happily. I love to talk about Alfred. It was the next best thing to being with him. So, of course, I suppose he thinks I'm a very stupid person. She looked with distaste at the bits of digestive biscuits and then took one. Oh no, he doesn't, I said, inventing, because Alfred had never put forward any opinion on the subject one way or another. I'm sure he must really. You don't mean to tell me that he thinks I'm clever? Oh yes, very clever. Very, very clever. He perhaps doesn't look upon you, though, as an intellectual. Crash! I was in the trap. Oh, indeed. Not an intellectual. I could see at once that she was terribly offended and thrashed about unhappily in my trap, trying to extricate myself to no avail. However, I was in it up to my neck. You see, he doesn't believe that women are ever intellectuals. Well, hardly ever, very, very rarely. Perhaps 1 in 10 million. Sort of like Virginia Woolf, perhaps. I suppose he thinks that I never read books. Many people think that because they see me leading this very, very active life, wearing myself out for others. I might prefer to sit in a chair all day and read some book. Very likely I would, but I shouldn't think it right in my position to do so. I can't only be thinking of myself, you see. Well, she rose to leave. One learns and one lives. I know nowadays that I am beyond the pale, intellectually. In their rage and disappointment at Polly's behaviour, the Montdors disinherit Polly and send for the next in line, an unknown Canadian, last heard of living in Nova Scotia, no doubt some kind of half-civilized lumberjack. The heir, called Cedric, eventually tracked down living in Paris, is invited to Hampton. No lumberjack he. A glitter of blue and gold. Here's the gold, and somewhere here's the blue. A glitter of blue and gold crossed the parquet, and a human dragonfly was kneeling at the fur rug in front of the Montdors, one long white hand extended towards each. He was a tall, thin young man, supple as a girl, dressed in a rather bright blue suit. His hair was the gold of a brass bedknob. He was flashing a smile of unearthly perfection. Cedric, outrageous, flamboyant and unashamedly camp. He transforms the lives of this newly discovered relations, in particular that of Lady Montmore, whom he turns from a stout old woman, impervious to fashion, to a lithe, bird-like creature with the blue curls and the brilliant, flashing smile. So absorbing is this new way of life, facial massage, punishing diets, ups and downs to London for parties, that Polly is forgotten until she and Boy turned up from a prolonged honeymoon on the continent, both of them sick to death with each other. Polly soon abandons her husband for a neighbouring duke, while Boy, Cedric, and Lady Montdor roll off in the Daimler to France, leaving Lord Montdor in possession of Hampton and a peaceful old age. The book is dominated by two great comic characters, Cedric and Lady Montdor, both loathed by the greatest comic character of all, though, Uncle Matthew. "The hell hag!" he says of Lady Montdor. "I'd drown her if I were Montdor." Whilst as to Cedric, Uncle Matthew, after one look, found that the word sewer had become obsolete and inadequate. Lady Montdor, magnificent in her rudeness, magnificent in her grandeur. I think I may say we put Injar on the map. Hardly any of one's friends in England had ever even heard of Injar before we went there. It's a wonderful portrait of a self-centered importance, though beneath this veneer there is a vulnerability and innocence which makes it impossible to regard her as wholly, wholly monstrous, though she's pretty close to it. Gaston Paluski was possessed of all the qualities that, to an English eye, epitomizes the sophisticated Frenchman. He was charming, he was amusant, he was a great lover of the arts and an incorrigible womanizer. He was also a shrewd politician. His parents were clever, cultivated people, and Gaston himself was educated at the Sorbonne, after which he came to England for a year's postgraduate study at Oxford. His political career started early. It was in 1934 that he began his lifelong association with Charles de Gaulle. Far from meeting at the railway station in Paris, they, Gaston and Nancy, met by arrangement on a warm summer's evening in 1942 in the garden of the Allies Club, the most congenial meeting place for officers in exile. He charmed and flattered her. He gossiped, joked, and made her feel every minute that she was with him, that she was the center of his undivided attention. But remember, he was French. A few days later, she invited him to dine with her in Blomfield Road. The Colonel enjoyed himself. Women were his greatest weakness. He could not see a pretty woman without wanting to make love to her, and Nancy was no exception. The pattern was quickly established between them. Several evenings a week he would dine with her at Blomfield Road, arriving usually very late in a taxi. But what was a pleasant pastime for Paluski soon became the very breath of life to Nancy. Like her heroine Linda, she was filled with a strange, wild, unfamiliar happiness, and for the first time in her life she knew that this was love. She was drunk with excitement, lived only for her meetings with the Colonel, and in between those meetings for their long, teasing chats on the telephone. His absence abroad left her desperate, worried, and nervous. She pined for letters, and since he often couldn't tell her where he was or what he was doing, she never knew when he might make contact. The meetings were agonizingly brief, and when he did arrive, he shot off very, very early in the morning and got back to his work with de Gaulle, and she was left desperate, not quite knowing what the game was. Soon? How soon shall I see you again? Oh, on fera la navette. He went to the window. I thought I heard a car. Oh yes, it's turning round. There, I must go. Au revoir. He kissed her hand politely, almost absent-mindedly. It was as if he had clearly already gone and walked quickly from the room. Linda went to the open window and leaned out. Those final words of his, navette, navette, are what Nancy must often have felt. Navette meaning, as I'm sure you know, I didn't, shuttle service, i.e. a lot of travelling backwards and forwards. I'm a busy man. The blessing is a very beautiful, very English, the story of a very beautiful English woman called Grace, who marries a very French marquis, by whom she has a son, Sigismund. Of course, the Marquis, Charles Edward de Valoubert, is Paluski, promoted by a lover and flatteringly described. Whereas in reality, Paluski, as we know, was stocky and pockmarked. I read a description of him as looking like an old potato. But here, and this is supposed to be, I don't understand, but it's supposed to be flattering, the Marquis is tall and elegant. The point is that Grace is as Nancy would have liked to have been. Within a month of their meeting, the Marquis proposes marriage to her and insists on a speedy marriage because the war will begin very soon and anything may happen. I need a son. Both do happen, and it's only after 7 years that the Marquis arrives unexpectedly in order to take Grace to the ancestral home in Provence. It became apparent early on in their stay that Grace would have problems adjusting and adapting, let alone accepting some of the social customs of France. Two old family friends, lovers of some 60 years earlier, are discussing Grace's relationship with the Marquis. It will be hard for Grace. Charles Edward is a good, warm-hearted boy. He won't be able to help making her miserable, but he will suffer too. Oh dear, what could have induced him to marry an English woman? These English, with their terrible jealousy. But the English husbands, how do they manage? English husbands, they go to their clubs, their boat race, their Royal Academy. They don't care for making love one tiny bit. So, they are always perfectly faithful to their wives. Books are well written or badly written. That is all, said Oscar Wilde. Language is at the heart of that. Nancy Mitford had a real gift for language and is worth reading for that alone. She is also witty, sharp, and entertaining, with a clear eye for the absurd. And finally, for the more romantic of you, Nancy never did marry her Colonel Belusky. He never intended that. But even after he had married a French duchess, they kept in touch, and she adored him as much as ever. She died a lingering death and in excruciating pain of a particularly nasty form of cancer in April 1972. And just before that, as representative of the French government, Belusky came to her house to make her a Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur. She was living in Versailles at the time. He was living somewhere away with his new wife. She could barely walk that day, but Diana helped her down the stairs, and she stood at the foot of them, while the love of her old life pinned the decoration to her dress. The tears poured down her face. It would have been a fitting end to the story, but Nancy still had a year to live. In June 1973, Belusky had what he later called a premonition that I must see her. So he drove to her house once more, where lay a barely conscious Nancy, and ran up the stairs to her bedroom. Oh, Fabrice, on vous entend si longtemps, comme c'est gentil. Words which she had uttered many times before, but on this occasion was too weak to utter. It may be that she heard the bark of Belusky's spaniel, but it seems that Nancy smiled when he took her hand. She lay back, and as she had written of someone else, all was light and warmth. A few hours later, Nancy died. That was, said the Colonel, our last meeting. And that's the end of me for this morning. Thank you. Yes, you can ask questions. I probably won't know the answers, but I can make up. Good. That's okay then.
Thank you for bringing into life a world long since gone. Probably a world never attainable to most of us anyway. But you certainly inspired me to read The Pursuit of Love. And there's obviously another career waiting for Mr. Field as an actor waiting in the wings there for him. And a third, if he doesn't like that, as an operatic baritone. A big thank you for the descriptions of a life long since gone. Sad, hilarious, but beautifully described. Thank you.